So today's talk, the topic is willpower versus wisdom, the path of the ascetic and the Buddha's middle way. As I was preparing for the talk, I think it's actually better to say willpower and wisdom because they're not necessarily in opposition. And I'll get into that more. Can everyone see the outline, by the way? Today I prepared an outline. This is no, not yet. Okay. It's nothing special, but it's the first time actually giving everyone an outline as I go along. So if you're taking notes, this can help you um, have a better, have more clarity about the structure of the talk. So hopefully it's useful, and you can give me feedback after we finish on if it is helpful. So we don't have the chance to talk to each other right now, but I'm curious as to why you folks came to the talk. Does the title Willpower, is it attractive? Because I've seen on social media, especially on YouTube, I see quite a few talks on willpower. I don't know why that is. Maybe it's because it knows I was searching that in my search engine. But in any case, I found some of these talks quite interesting. How other folks talk about willpower and in what context. But I'm curious, in coming to this talk, do you find that your willpower, excuse me, do you find that your willpower is strong, but that it can be a source of suffering? Or is it that you feel your willpower is weak and that could be a source of distress also? Or is it that sometimes you feel you have a stronger will, sometimes it's weak, and maybe that can be a problem as well, a feeling of inconsistency. So in today's talk, I hope to address this willpower. So the basic outline of today's talk is I'll talk about willpower in general. Then I'll talk about asceticism, which is willpower in the context of religious practice. We can call that asceticism, as well as asceticism taken to the extreme. And then I'll talk about willpower in the context of Buddhist practice, as well as extremism of will in this context of Buddhist practice. And then finally, I'll talk about willpower and wisdom, which we can say is the middle way, the Zhongdao, as it's called in Chinese, the middle way of the Buddha's approach to living. Okay, so that's a general outline for today. I'll start with talking about willpower. What is it? So, I did do a search on willpower just to get a definition. I was curious how it's defined in some popular dictionaries. So, the definition from the Merriam-Webster dictionary is that willpower is the ability to control one's own actions, emotions, or urges. That's the definition. To control our actions, emotions, or urges. Okay, so that's one sense of it, an ability to control ourselves. The definition that I had thought of before even looking that up was that willpower is the strength of our intention coming from a strong desire to succeed in something. So I see willpower as not necessarily control, but it could just be a strong intention. And an intention to do what? There has to be an object, right? So an intention to succeed in something, to succeed in achieving a goal. And I think we can also look at willpower as an effect. It can be a cause, it can be an effect. Um, if we have an ongoing strong intention, the effect is that all of our mind, all of our thoughts become concentrated. So we could say willpower as a cause is generating a strong intention. As an effect or result, it's concentration or a powerful mind or the power of one's mind coming from concentration. Okay. That's how I see it. And first, I think it's important to talk about what are the beneficial qualities of willpower and how is it useful. Well, if we look at survival, just being a human, being a living being, willpower is essential to survive, right? If we didn't have any willpower, if we didn't have any strong intention to live and to survive, we would probably just die. We wouldn't go and search for food. We wouldn't try to protect ourselves in times of danger. We wouldn't try to protect others. We'd just sit there and be like, well, whatever. If I'm going to die, I'm going to die. If everybody else dies, then everybody else dies. But of course, from our experience, we know that in most situations, we don't want to die. We want to avoid death or hardship, such as, calamities, starvation, danger. So for survival, willpower, we could say is a very basic quality of being a living being and a human. We can also say that willpower develops character, right? So just think of things that are difficult, something that's difficult and we don't want to do it. Um, maybe work for some of us is difficult and unpleasant. We don't want to do it, but we still do it because we know we have to. We have an obligation to work. We have an obligation to work, to provide a service, to make money, to feed ourselves and our family, provide for them. So doing something when we don't want to do it, when it's unpleasant, we can say builds character. The character of being able to deal with or to endure hardship, something unpleasant, and get things done. And we can say in the long run, or from a longer perspective, that accomplishing goals requires willpower as well, right? For something that takes time, that's difficult, just think of a project, long project, you know, even building a structure. Building a large building can take months, years, and even 100 years or centuries. I just happened to be talking with a family member about, great structures of human civilization. And if we look at some of the cathedrals or churches built in Europe, how long did it take to build those? For some of them, it took like 100 or over 100 years. So that's a very long-term goal, which requires a lot of will to accomplish it. The will of not only one person, but many people. So goals require will and consistency and ongoing willpower to succeed. And we can also say that not only, creating things or building structures is difficult. We could say that even functioning as a society and having some degree of harmony is difficult. If we look at our own country, or I don't know what country you're from or you're in now, but in America, the whole civil rights, the situation of civil rights in America, uh, has taken or is taking many, many years. to go from a system of inequality to trying to have a system or a way of society that's more equal or that's more fair and just. So civil rights and all the hardship that people have to go through, our ancestors and leaders and everyone, the difficulty that everyone has to go through to establish harmony, civil rights takes a lot of willpower, ongoing willpower. Of course, things like improving our health requires willpower. I don't know how many of you folks have started a New Year's resolution this year. Are you still doing it? Some people want to go to the gym, get healthier, get stronger, get muscular, lose weight, all of that, have a better diet. All of that requires will. No pain, no gain, right? Um, and with willpower, we can even exceed the normal limitations of, let's say, the typical human, right? So, for example, the typical human being or the typical person, we walk how many steps a day? I don't know, some 1,000 to maybe 10,000 steps a day. Maybe that's a couple miles at most. Some people can do ultra marathons and run hundreds of miles over a few days, which is exceeding the normal limitation of a human's capacity. To do that requires will and training, sustained willpower. But also, doesn't doesn't embarking on the path of spiritual practice, or I actually don't like the word spiritual because it almost sounds like it's leaving behind the material and the psychological, but to engage in a practice like Buddhism or the practice of mindfulness, training our mind, doesn't that take willpower also? Doesn't it require doesn't it require an intention to want to better ourselves and an intention to want to leave behind suffering or resolve our suffering? So embarking on a path like this also requires will and sustained will. I'm not sure how many of you folks are familiar with what I'll talk about now, which is asceticism. In the context of spiritual practice, I'll use that word spiritual practice just to refer to, let's say, the practice of training our mind. Let's call that spiritual practice. So it could be Buddhism, it could be another religious practice like Hinduism, could be Christianity, could be anything, could be just the practice of meditation. Some people just practice a more secular form of yoga or meditation, mindfulness in general. This practice of training our mind and transforming our character, there is an approach to this called asceticism. Um, and what is it? Let's define it first. So again, I went to the dictionary just to see how a popular dictionary would define asceticism. And the Oxford Dictionary defines it as severe self-discipline and avoidance of all forms of indulgence, typically for religious reasons. Kind of interesting. Severe self-discipline, avoiding indulgence, referring to likely sense pleasures, sensual pleasures, whatever we see, hear, feel, touch, taste, that's pleasant and enticing. Um, my general definition was just utilizing willpower to achieve success in spiritual practice. Um, I think that's more clear that asceticism is using willpower. We can look at it as enduring hardship to defeat one's craving or aversion or all kinds of psychological troubles. Um, because with asceticism, we're basically depriving ourselves of excess. So basically, we're just not drinking and eating to the point of being super full. We're not just going out to enjoy good feelings and good music and um, going to watch movies and things like that. Asceticism is completely minimizing one's activities and even minimizing uh, taking what's needed. So for example, an ascetic usually would live in a place that's farther from society, far away from society, because it's such a very drastic and uh, extreme way of living that it can be difficult to do in the middle of society. So ascetics, whether it was during the Buddha's time or present time, often live outside of society. They, not always, but they may live in the woods, for example, live in a harsh climate, because part of asceticism is dealing with the harshness of the environment, not to make ourselves too comfortable. So an ascetic shelter would be very minimal. They wouldn't have necessarily a wood stove and a comfy bed and all of this. It'd be very minimal so that at least they're not going to die. But it could be quite cold, or if it's a hot environment, it could be very hot. Shelter is very minimal. Clothing is very minimal. There are even ascetics who practice without clothing. They're just called naked ascetics because they don't wear clothes. And they're referred to in some cases in Buddhist sutras. There's some stories about when the Buddhist monks and nuns would encounter the naked ascetics. Like how would they interact? What would they talk about? Um, so shelter is minimal, clothing is minimal, food is minimal, stimulation, of course, minimal. They'd even refrain from conversation. So it's a very strict life of extreme minimalist living. So I hope that paints a picture. And likely they're doing a lot of sitting meditation or practices to concentrate and develop their willpower. A lot of meditation, sitting, sitting even to the point where it hurts, to their legs are numb, maybe their whole body is numb, maybe they're weak and they're about to fall over, but they continue to sit. So some of them may prop themselves up on something, or some of them may tie a rope to themselves so that they don't fall over from sitting. Some may just lean up against a tree if they're going to fall over and try to continue to sit. Some ascetics do a walking practice where they're just walking constantly without stopping. There's a practice within Chinese Buddhism, which is called Bozo Sanmei. I don't know if you've heard of that. I actually don't know the English translation, but it's basically just walking, standing constantly. You don't sit down, you don't lie down. So, I asked someone who knew about this practice, "Well, what do you do when you're tired?" They said, well, you just hold on to a rope that's hanging from the ceiling and you try your best to stand there. And if you fall, you fall, but then you wake up and you get back up again. And most people who do that practice would say they can't stand still at that point because if you stand still, you may fall asleep. So they try their best to keep walking. So it sounds like torture and it's borderline torture, but what they're doing is they're trying to train their willpower to endure even the hardship of not sleeping most of the time. Technically, do they sleep? I think they must sleep. They must pass out at some point. One person said they did sleep standing. Another person said they only ended up sleeping 1 to 2 hours a night. But I think for the average person, that would probably lead to health issues, psychosis eventually, possibly. So these are extreme practices. what's the benefit of this? We may ask. Well, there are some merits. There are some merits, and not all ascetic practices are so extreme. Some ascetics will just, again, take the minimal shelter, clothing, food, and they sleep, but they try not to sleep too much. They really minimize sleep, even. There is a merit in that a person who goes through this practice really reduces their craving for comforts, for pleasant feelings, pleasant sensations. They learn to not crave for food. They train themselves to not crave for anything. I don't know if you could imagine what that's like, or does it really work? Maybe you think. Do they really not crave for anything? Or if they finish their practice, do they like, first thing they do is they go and have a pizza or whatever their favorite food is, big bowl of rice and meat or whatever. But many people who engage in this practice do say that that's one of the merits, the reduction of craving for comfort. As mentioned before, it's resilience in the face of hardship. So not only going to work when we don't want to go to work, but enduring a lot of pain and discomfort from even not eating, uh, you know, not only do they not eat so that they're full, but they eat just enough to survive. That can be quite difficult, painful. But in the face of hardship, a person's willpower can get quite strong, and the mind can be less bothered by such unpleasant experiences. So through this practice, the mind is becoming simplified with minimalistic living towards the extreme. The mind does, excuse me, the mind does become simplified as well. Less thoughts about what I want to do, what I don't want to do. A simpler and calmer mind can result from this kind of practice. And this is how concentration can develop. So we know from the Buddha's story, we know from the history of spiritual practice in India, as well as China, and many countries have their own ascetics. I think probably every society has their own ascetics or hermits who engage in these practices. What results is a very powerful mind, very few distracting thoughts. And this concentration can be developed to the point of what's called samadhi, or meditative absorption, where a person's mind can be detached from caring about the body, caring about the environment, and just becomes absorbed internally in a state of calm, deep state of calm and clarity. As the Buddha told in his story, there were many people practicing this way, and samadhi was the goal. That was the goal of their spiritual practice, to reach an absorption or a state where it was as if nothing existed except this sense of peace, this peaceful sense of self. And some goals were to, um, in this state of samadhi, to unite with the universal and the universal spiritual self. These were beliefs that are held by other traditions, not Buddhist, but other spiritual traditions, where the goal of spiritual practice is to enter this absorption and experience unity with the entire universe. So there is some merit to this practice, to simplify the mind, to develop concentration, and absorb oneself in these states of great peace and freedom. But there's a cost, right? There's a cost of extreme asceticism. What is the cost? What are some of the costs? Well, it can actually be damaging to a person's health. Not eating, not eating enough, eating very little. Very little means basically not eating what the body needs to maintain its current functionings. I think a lot of folks now are into diet, so You may have heard maintenance calories, right? Maintenance calories just means that we're eating enough to keep our body at the same weight, which basically means that we're maintaining all of our functions, all of our tissues, and although they're changing, the body is in a state of homeostasis, of balance, which is, you could say, a basis of good health. We're not shrinking or shriveling away. Uh, our muscles are not atrophying. Our bones are not crumbling. We're maintaining this stable state of change. Still changing, but it's stable. If a person's really eating very little, what's happening to the body? It's basically gradually decaying. If you don't have enough protein, your muscles will decay. If we don't have enough calcium and other vitamins, our bones will decay. And you may have seen the picture of the Buddha when he was practicing extreme asceticism, or the statue, not the picture, but the statue of this completely emaciated human with kind of scraggly hair and the ribs showing. You could even not only see the ribs, but even the mass of the stomach and the abdomen was so um, uh, emaciated that you could almost see the spine. So it can be very damaging to the body if this is a long-term practice. It's rejecting or ignoring the basic needs of health. In terms of psychologically, what can asceticism do to a person? Well, I haven't met too many ascetics, but I met some people who were doing solitary retreat and doing somewhat of an ascetic practice, developing willpower, trying to enter into these states of samadhi, absorption. What happens often is a person can get grumpy. A person can develop a temperament which is quite angry, grumpy, unpleasant to be around, but very strong will. Um, and with this sort of attitude of anger, why does that happen? Well, if we just, and you may have experience of this, just using the strength of our mind, willpower to do something, there may be a sort of anger there or an intensity of concentration. And if that's not kept in check, that can turn into anger. Um, and maybe something we can relate to if you're exercising or if you were jogging or doing something that was really hard, but you're doing it for the sake of, getting in better shape. It's like, pushing really hard. You may have this sort of feeling of anger. I hate this, but I got to do it. I hate this. I hate how I feel. Why am I running? I hate running. Still, still pushing so that we can achieve that goal. And in a context of spiritual practice, there are even some traditions that call this kind of training a spiritual war. It's like being at war with oneself, or being at war with temptation, or at war with these unwholesome psychological states. Spiritual war of sorts. That kind of attitude is quite aggressive. And in time, that can develop a person's temperament into an angry temperament, a rigid temperament. And that can create all kinds of problems just for the person themselves. They may not recognize it after a while, but they've become this grumpy spiritual practitioner. Probably the people who are close to them, if they have any friends, uh, probably feel that it's not fun to be around them. My teacher, Master Shengyan, would tell some stories of old monks that he knew. And these old monks, they were meditating a lot, but they were never trained how to meditate. So he didn't really know what methods they were using, but he found out that many of them were just very grumpy, kind of nasty attitudes. You'd think that an old monk would be, very calm and happy and kind and kind of cute after all those years of practicing compassion and wisdom. But he said they probably because they weren't trained well. They didn't understand the Dharma and they didn't learn how to meditate properly. Likely they were using willpower to suppress their distracted thinking or to suppress their emotions and cravings. And suppression will lead to a sense of anger and irritability. So that's a potential cost and can happen if we just rely on willpower to deal with the extremes of asceticism, or extreme asceticism can lead to these attitudes of anger and rigid personality. This kind of person would probably not have the greatest relationships as well, because I don't know how many people would want to hang out with this kind of an ascetic, or even understand what they're doing. But if you just think about using willpower to overcome things, what about in relationships? If someone disagrees with us, if we're used to using willpower to even conquer ourselves, we're probably going to try to use willpower to conquer other people and just win arguments, push our opinion. Um, I think I'm at fault for that. There was a period of time in my own practice where I was using quite a bit of intensity, too much tension, and I became irritable and I also became impatient. So when interacting with people, I was like, I was the grumpy monk. I wasn't old at the time, I guess relatively. I was in my 20s. I was the grumpy young monk from pushing too hard and using too much will. Um, so our relationships can suffer with willpower, with an overuse of willpower and rigidity. And just to illustrate um, a bit more of how ascetics can take things to the extreme, I've heard, I don't know how much truth there is to this. It could be rumor, but it almost seems like it could be true, where some ascetics would intentionally harm themselves or intentionally put themselves through very, very harsh hardships. For example, self beating, self flogging, where they would hit themselves, not necessarily as a punishment, but in some cases as punishment. And this even appears in Western religious contexts, or if you've read The Scarlet Letter, that novel, Scarlet Letter, where I believe it was a priest or a minister had an affair with one of the town's one of the women of the town, and he flogged himself as a punishment. This was part of his spiritual purification, self-flogging, to take on this hardship in hopes that it would uh, purify one's mind and clear one up of all of the sin or bad karma of one's behavior. There are also some ascetics who are said to have eaten animal feces. Have you heard about that? I don't get that, but at the same time, I tried to imagine, maybe it was true. Maybe there are some of these ascetics who are like, yeah, you know, I can go without food, and they're competing with each other. Who can endure the worst hardship? So someone says, "Oh yeah, you want to see a hardship? Look at this. I'm going to eat this." And they take a bite out of animal feces. I don't know if it's true, but it could be this twisted kind of state of mind where a person is trying to endure these unthinkable hardships and use willpower to overcome in hopes of some sort of spiritual purification. In the Buddha's own story, he said that he almost died. He said that after 5 years or so, or many years of ascetic practice, he almost died because of not eating enough. You may have heard that. He became emaciated. And he said he had no energy. He had no energy to even sit there. He was so weak, but his willpower was strong. But he realized this was a problem. He realized that just having a strong will can't liberate us from suffering. Just being consistently enduring hardship, to consistently endure hardship, strengthen one's will, and enter states of absorption, it doesn't free us from suffering. Because no matter what, those states of freedom we experience in meditation pass. They don't last. When the person gets up from sitting, or when they have to do something remotely complicated and engage with the world, with people, their sense of freedom is gone. So what about Buddhism? I'll talk now about willpower in the Buddhist context. The Buddha, when he was practicing asceticism, this was before his own insights, which then spawned what has become a religion. But the insights of Buddhism can be traced back to the Buddha's first insight that extreme asceticism is a problem and causes more harm than merit, and it can't liberate us. He eventually, through doing practice in his own way, which I'll talk about a bit later, he realized that um, not only through willpower, but through wisdom, we can be free from suffering. Before I talk about what is wisdom, I just like to talk about willpower in the context of Buddhist practice. Because there is, as I said, when we start on this path of practice, it's an intention to succeed in resolving our suffering. There's a clear goal and there's a strong intention. That's willpower. In Mahayana Buddhism especially, but technically in all of the Buddha's teachings, there's an emphasis on benefiting all beings, not just benefiting ourselves, benefiting all living beings, all beings um, that have a sense of self, that experience feelings, emotion, that are conscious. In Buddhism, there's something called the Great Compassionate Vow, right? I think most of you folks who are practicing Buddhism have heard this, the Da Bei Yuan. Maybe it's the first time you're hearing it, but the Great Compassionate Vow, Da Bei Yuan, is a strong intention to live an awakened life, to commit to a wakeful way of living. It means to help be wakeful, or we could say a wise way of living, free or freer from suffering. And in the process, we hope to help others also live more wakefully. We hope that others, due to our own practice, that they benefit and they also learn to live with less suffering, with more sense of freedom. Um, this is willpower. This is willpower applied to this aspiration to awaken and to help others live this wakeful life. So in Buddhism, it's not called willpower, it's called vow power, yuan li, right? The word for willpower, I do believe occurs in some places in the Buddha's teaching. It's kind of uh, in the context of meditation often, but in this general approach to practice, vow power, this great compassionate vow is very important. And we have what's called the four great vows, right? Vowing to benefit all beings, vowing to ending, resolving our own suffering, and vowing to learn endless ways to help others and to help ourselves. Learn all the various practices or approaches to helping to resolve suffering. That could be a formal approach, for example, um, a way to meditate or a way to study the teachings. It could be a very informal thing. It could just refer to a very skillful response to a problem. That could be one of these practices to help help beings awaken. And the fourth vow is this ideal of Buddhism, which is called Buddhahood, which is really the perfection of one's character, the perfection of one's mind. There is this idea that a human being can be completely free from suffering, completely at ease with all the hardships of life and death, and at the same time to be endlessly skillful in dealing with problems, in dealing with people and responding to situations. This is the ideal of Buddhahood. So these are not just little vows; these are huge vows, right? Perfection, um, perfect learning, perfect response to things, no suffering, helping all beings without considering how many we've helped. This is a very kind of virtuous uh, vow. But again, there can be a problem. Even within this context of Buddhist practice, I've seen and I've experienced there can be a problem. And what is the problem? Well, we could have this compassionate vow to help liberate ourselves and others, but if we're lacking wisdom, meaning if we have a lot of attachments, then and a strong mind with a lot of attachments leads to big problems. And I'll explain. I'd like to use some examples. In the kind of Buddhist context, how could this compassionate vow go wrong when there's no wisdom or if we're lacking in wisdom? So I reflected on myself and all the mistakes that I made as I made up this list, and you can also reflect on yourself as well. Are you an extreme Buddhist? So, is it possible, for example, with regards to our sleep, that we also try to sleep as little as we can? Or that because we read in the sutras that the monks and nuns, they would stay up until 2 a.m. No, wait, I think it was you would meditate from 10 to 2, sleep from 2 to 4, and then get up and meditate again from 4 to whatever, whenever it was time to go for the alms rounds to beg for food. So how many hours of sleep is that? That's about 2 hours of sleep with meditation before and after. So do we push ourselves to wake up super early and thinking that, well, this is my great vow. This is what Buddhist practice has to be. On retreats, they wake up at 4, so I'm going to wake up at 4 too. But what happens if we do that when we actually need more like 5 hours, 7 hours, 8 hours of sleep? What happens to our body if we don't get enough sleep? Because we're pushing ourselves. Um, I saw a couple of podcasts about Arnold Schwarzenegger, talking about his approach to sleep and, having a strong will and that, we don't need more than, however, 4 hours or 5 hours of sleep. I forget the number, but it was not the typical amount. It sounds great that a person could sleep less and make use of time, but really, what are we doing to ourselves if we're forcing ourselves not to sleep for the sake of spiritual practice, more meditation? There are some folks who try to sleep sitting up through the whole night. They just try to meditate and sleep sitting up. I don't know, is that healthy? I've seen some with pretty poor posture. I don't know if that's from, meditating sitting like this and their neck is bent over all night. Um, I don't know if that's what happened, but Is that healthy? What about diet? What do we do with our diet? Are we extreme with that? Do we tell ourselves, well, because the Buddha and all the monastics, they just ate one meal a day, so I'm going to do that too. I'm just going to eat once a day. Even for modern day monastics, I don't know how healthy this is. A modern day monastic is probably doing a lot more work than a monastic during the Buddha's time, where during the Buddha's time, they went walking for alms, they gave Dharma talks, they engaged with people, then they'd go back and they meditate all day. Meditate, maybe take a nap, do some walking meditation, sit again, listen to a Dharma talk, right? Compared to monastics now who are running retreat centers, traveling, flying all over, leading activities, having meetings late at night with uh, their organizations that are across the globe. A modern day monastic even needs more than one meal a day. Uh, and how much more so do lay people probably need more than one meal, which you could squeeze in how many? Maybe a 1,200 calories, 1,500 calories before your stomach blows, feels terribly uncomfortable. So what about diet? Do we push ourselves too much with diet? Exercise could be the same. Do we work out until exhaustion to get healthy? Or maybe for some Buddhists, they hear that, well, Buddhism says that our body is just a bag of flesh. I think in Chinese it's like a 臭皮囊, right? Which just means like a stinking bag of flesh that we shouldn't cherish it and crave for pleasant feelings or try to look good. It's just a body. But if we don't exercise at all, or if we exercise too much, isn't that a problem? If we look at work, maybe it's the same. A Buddhist may have this idea that they not only need to do what they're obliged to do, but maybe they feel they need to do as much as possible in every day and make sure that everyone's happy. Um, I'm at fault myself for doing this in the past of working too much just so that people are happy or so that I think they'll be happy with me or so that I think they'll just be happy in general. Working too much so that everyone is happy. Um, is that really going to accomplish that goal of making everyone happy? Could we be overworking for the sake of a virtuous uh, cause like that? And not only work, but what about volunteering? Buddhists who volunteer a lot. I've seen this when I was a monk and still see it now, where volunteers, because they have the intention to be of service and share the Buddhist teachings, right? So Buddhist centers, they have a lot of activities, they need a lot of help, and they're often understaffed because there aren't many monastics to go around. So you need a lot of support from lay people and from volunteers. And for some volunteers, they may volunteer so much that they exhaust themselves. They burn out because on top of work and family responsibilities, they then do more. They volunteer for the center and use up almost all of their energy on volunteering, even to the point where their family may start to wonder, where's mom or where's dad? They're always at the center, but they're never home. It's like, as once mom started learning Buddhism, she like disappeared. What happened? Or once dad started volunteering, it's like, all the stuff that he did around the house is sort of not getting done. So what's happening? And the family members may feel actually unloved because the family member who's volunteering has put all of their intention on sharing the Dharma, delivering sentient beings, supporting the center, and they may feel bad for the monastics who are so working so hard that I've heard people say, well, look at the monks and nuns, they work so hard, they don't sleep much. I have to work just as hard. And it can lead to volunteer burnout. So this is a big one, I think. This aspiration to serve, but doing too much. And Sometimes even the monastics don't notice that they're asking too much of the lay people because they're used to working so hard and they live there. They may forget that the volunteers, the lay people, have families to take care of, have work to take care of. So it can be a problem when our vow and our will to serve creates imbalance in our life. So there are lots of other examples, but I don't think I need to go into it. I think you get the point. So what is now willpower and wisdom together? What is the middle way? I think it's first important to define what is wisdom. What is wisdom? This word is used a lot. 智慧 in Chinese. Wisdom, we could say, is just not creating suffering. Not creating suffering for ourselves is wisdom. Um, 智慧不起烦恼, as Master Sheng Yen would put it. Simply not creating problems for ourselves. Not creating external problems, but more importantly, the source of external problems is really internal problems. Using our mind in a way which causes all sorts of emotional turmoil and troubles. That's lacking wisdom. When we learn to stop creating all sorts of emotional turmoil, when we learn how to stop doing that, that's wisdom. How do we stop doing that? We could say the source of suffering is clinging to our thoughts and ideas, which is basically self-centeredness, believing that our thoughts and our ideas are just ultimate. It's the truth. It's just got to be this way. On a subtle level, clinging to our thoughts and ideas as ourself, clinging to our self-image, which is basically the image in our mind of ourself. It could be a very concrete picture, like when we see our face in the mirror, or it could be a more subtle feeling that this is me. This is a clinging to thought as self. Once we do that, our self feels permanent. Things around us feel permanent and separate. We then see the world as a bunch of permanent and separate selves, all interacting with each other. But with that view of life, with a view of ourself and the world based on our very limited self-centered views and perspectives, all sorts of problems can happen. Like I mentioned before, the person who has a strong mind, but if they don't have wisdom, they may be very attached to their own ideas. So if you get into an argument with an ascetic, you may be in for a really tough argument. Or if you get into an argument with a person who meditates a lot, who has a certain degree of calmness and stability, but they have a very rigid set of views and ideas, you may be in for trouble. They may be unmovable in terms of their view of things. So a strong mind with strong attachments, that's trouble. It's asking for trouble. Wisdom is a strong mind without attachments. Or along the way with less attachments, or gradually lessening attachments to ideas, to views. So in one of the first teachings of the Buddha, he said the middle way is simply freedom from views, freedom from extreme views of this or that, being or non-being, self or nothingness. So to put this into, an example, context, with spiritual practice, we may get into the practice because of the idea of enlightenment, right? The idea that something can happen that transforms us and our suffering just goes away. Many people, including myself, when I first started, the first teachings I encountered were the Chan and Zen teachings, which talks about sudden enlightenment. And I was like, wow, sudden enlightenment. That sounds great. I want that. I want the sudden enlightenment. I don't want the gradual stuff. I don't need samadhi. Just give me the sudden enlightenment. So I'd be reading all these books on Chan and Zen and hearing all these teachings of so and so Zen master just hit the student and the student was enlightened. I was like, yeah, yes, that will be me one day. Let me just read enough. Let me just keep meditating. And one day I'll just like bump into something and I'll get enlightened. I really had the idea that it was just this one occasion that could solve everything. And there was even one point where I thought that enlightenment meant that you could see your mind of wisdom because these terms are used a lot. Mind of wisdom, 智慧心. There's a saying called seeing the self nature, especially used a lot in Chan, 见性, 明心见性. It's very concrete in a way. There's a lot of imagery there to illuminate the mind and see the self nature. That's 明心见性. So I remember thinking, I just need to sit here, clear my mind, get rid of all these thoughts so I can illuminate it and then I can see it. And once I could see my wisdom mind, then I'll be all set. So I think it was the first retreat that I was on and I was meditating very hard. I was the little young ascetic. I was, still a layperson at the time, sitting meditating. I was using so much force to try to suppress my distracted thinking and just see my wisdom mind that I could actually hear something happening with like the blood flow to my head. I could hear, I don't know, sometimes you can hear that when you have a fever, kind of blood flowing past your ears. I remember sitting there and hearing that sound and my brain feeling like it was just this like blank fog, but it kind of felt good. And I was like, wow, I think I'm getting closer. I think I'm gonna see my wisdom mind because it feels like there are no thoughts. It was a very powerful feeling. But I also got a headache a little while after, but at first it was very powerful. And it was a blank kind of mind with nothing there. And my body sense was also fading. So I remember hearing, oh, that's right. When the body sense fades, then you're getting deeper into it. So I had all these ideas in my head about what the wisdom mind is and that I could see it. And at the moment, Master Sheng happened to be walking in the room and he just adjusted my posture. He happened to be behind me and I felt these two fingers straighten my head up because I was so tight and tense that I was probably sitting like this, but I didn't notice it. I was using so much force, so much willpower to try to see wisdom. And he just adjusted my posture and I was like, oh, okay. Didn't realize I was doing that. It still took me quite a while to let go of that idea of seeking for a state called enlightenment. So this is an extreme view. This is the view of being. This is an extreme view that enlightenment is a thing, is a state. Opposite to that, some people have this idea of emptiness. This is another word used in Buddhism. They believe that emptiness is some kind of state, the absence of everything. So they're looking for the state of nothingness. That's also an extreme view. It's the mind trying to capture the experience of wisdom and make it into a thing. These are extreme views. This is not the middle way. So that's why in the Heart Sutra, which is a very popular teaching in especially in Mahayana Buddhism, it says there's no wisdom, no attainment. At first it's like, wait a second, didn't I get into this whole business to get wisdom, to get enlightened? But then it says there's no wisdom and no attainment, which is actually the middle way. Freedom from views, even freedom from views about spiritual practice. about wisdom, about insight, about enlightenment. Freedom from any kind of view is the middle way. So it's not clinging to views. What is practice like when we're not clinging to views? Does it mean we're just like dumb and we can't make judgments? We can't think? Not at all. We still have our experiences. We still make judgments about what's good and bad, what's a problem, what needs changing. But we realize it's just an experience. It's just our idea. It may not be right. It may be useful, but it's not ultimately right. And since enlightenment is not a thing, it's not just a state that fixes everything. Enlightenment or insight is actually a way of being without attachment to views. So what is that like? There was a Chan master. It's very popular because he would just tell people, go and have some tea. Master Zhao Zhou, many of you have probably heard that story. People would ask him all these questions about Buddhism, profound questions, and he'd say things like, did you eat yet? And they'd say, what? Did you eat yet? Yeah, yeah, I just ate. Go and wash your bowl. Or go and have some tea. At first, it sounds like he's just ignoring them and being disrespectful. But what he's really saying is, go practice the middle way. Can you just have some tea fully, mindfully, fully aware of having the tea, just washing our bowl without worrying about things, without worrying about so-called worldly things, also washing our bowl without obsessively thinking about enlightenment. When am I going to get enlightened? When am I going to get enlightened? Maybe if I break this bowl, something will happen and I'll wake up. There's so many stories, especially in Zen, where something breaks and someone has an insight. So after reading all this, we may end up doing things throughout our daily life and waiting for some sort of thing to happen. Is that the middle way? I'd say that's Buddhist extremism. That's obsession with enlightenment. That's obsession with Buddhist views. So just go and have some tea. Go and wash your bowl. Or do whatever. Go take a walk. Go do work. Have a conversation even. But just be fully there having a conversation. If we're fully aware of ourselves having a conversation and that our views are just views themselves, we won't be rigidly attached to them. So we'll probably find ourselves getting in less arguments if we can just um, be aware of our views without being attached to them. This is the middle way. So with this view, our practice changes. So we'd probably have a better care of ourself. We would sleep enough, we would eat enough, do enough exercise if it's necessary. Maybe our work itself is exercise, so we don't need to do too much. Maybe we need to move more, maybe we need to move less. We wouldn't be going to extremes, pushing ourselves because of our compassionate vow. We'd have a more skillful approach to caring for ourselves, caring for others. If we're volunteering, we could still volunteer for a center and work very hard. Occasionally, maybe we need to work harder than usual, so we get home late. But we wouldn't let volunteering, or we wouldn't let our virtuous aspiration, we wouldn't let our activism, as some people call it. Maybe you're part of an organization that's, um, you know, uh, doing something virtuous for society. With wisdom, we know how to work hard, but we also know how to rest. We know how to be assertive and state our views and try to state the problems that we see. But we also know that we don't have all the answers. I went to a school for environmental science, And there was quite a lot of activism there when I was there. Wow, a long time ago now. It was the year 2000. Environmentalism was strong, and um, but I didn't feel like joining. I didn't feel like joining the group because I saw so much anger. There's a lot of anger behind the activism, and I just didn't like it. I didn't feel I wanted to be a part of that. If there's anger with activism, is it possible that we're lacking wisdom and we're rigidly fixed on our views? We think we have all the answers, so we can easily criticize others. With wisdom, if we know we don't have all the answers, we know that we can be humble, but still assertive, can point out problems, ask questions, even give people pressure, but in a way that's not aggressive, not overly forceful and harmful. So we could say this approach to practice, both wisdom and a virtuous aspiration, combination of wisdom and the great compassionate vow is balanced, is the middle way, a kind of balance that's careful not to go to either extreme, careful not to cling to any views while still having ideas and and projects, aspirations. So I think I'll finish here, right? That's the middle way. Wisdom with willpower. That's the middle way.